So one of the best things, and maybe one of the most daunting things about moving into my own space, was just figuring out how I was going to organize it. About 6 weeks ago, I bought my first real big tool purchase, which was a SawStop contractor's saw. And needless to say, right after I bought it, I quickly realized how badly I needed a really big Outfeed / assembly table. Now, I did a ton of research about what would work best for my shop based on the size of it. My space is about 19 by 19 feet, so I needed something that was big enough to handle me working with giant sheet goods in case I wanted to build something big, but also something not so big that it overtook my entire space. So I ended up with a table that was 4 feet by 5 feet, and I think it is just under 34 inches tall, which is the height of my saw. And it has a top really large work surface as well as a bottom storage shelf that can be built out later depending on what kind of needs I will have down the road. So the entire project is made out of 3 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, and I designed it specifically so that I only needed that much material. Step 1 was just breaking down the sheets into manageable sizes, and using rigid foam insulation as a cutting surface is one of the more underrated and cheap Home Depot hacks that you should quickly adopt as a maker. And as I broke down my material, I was careful to label each piece as to not mix things up. Each of my legs was going to be created using 3-inch wide strips butt jointed together. And the key was to rip them all to their final width on the table saw and then gang cut them on the miter saw so that they were all the exact same length. I also ripped a few pieces on the saw that had 45-degree miters on them, and these would add shearing strength to the build, and you'll see what I'm talking about later. Everything on this build is assembled with glue and 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws. The screws are for initial strength, and the glue will give this build a long lifespan in my shop. So after making my 4 legs, I could attach everything with stretchers using glue and screws again. And I repeated this for both sides of the table. Next was much of the same thing, attaching the next set of stretchers on the bottom ahead of bringing all 4 legs together at the base. Now, before moving any further, I added those corner supports, which really increased the shearing strength of the table. And before final attachment, I added 2 stretchers across the bottom to help support that bottom shelf. So then I could combine everything together. Next up was attaching the bottom shelf, which I first glued on, and of course I brought in some hired help for this. Finish nails held this thing in place while the glue cured. The top went together much like the bottom did, using corner supports for rigidity and the middle supports to support the larger top that I would go back and add at the end. Once everything was connected, I could take my tabletop cuts and lay them on the table for final positioning. Now, to get everything squared up, I clamped both pieces in place and then left one in place, glued up the other piece, held it down with finish nails, and then repeated that process for the other cut. So since I wanted this thing to be really heavy, it's pretty heavy. My plan called for having a dual stack top, meaning that I would have one sheet of plywood actually attached to the base of this thing, and then another sheet on top that would only be held in place with finish nails. That way, if it got too dinged up, over time just from wear and tear, I could pull it off and replace it with a new piece of wood. Last up was to add miter slots to the side of the table that touched the table saw. To make sure the table was square, I used a speed square and then traced a line from the edge of the table and then ran the square along the table saw edge to make sure my measurement always stayed on that line. Then after a few measurements and setting the final depth of my router, I routed out the 2 grooves. And I think I did 2 passes with a 1-inch dado bit to actually cut that slot. So like I said before, I don't have exact measurements for this table. It is 4 feet by 5 feet. It is just under 34 inches tall, and it has 2 shelves. It's built from 3 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. I think the important thing for these videos in terms of shop furniture is not so much to try to replicate exactly what you see somebody build, but instead do lots of research and pull lots of inspiration to figure out what is going to work best for your space. So with that said, I really encourage you to check out all the videos online that have shop furniture projects that you're interested in doing, especially the ones that I posted below so you could see where I pulled the design inspiration from, because they were super useful to me in trying to figure out how I want to build out my space. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you did enjoy it, I welcome you to subscribe to the channel.
You got sawdust on you.
Sawdust on you. You want to play with the table? Huh? If you did like the video, I welcome you to subscribe to the channel. Hopefully you'll be seeing tons of projects coming out of this shop down the road, and it would be awesome if you guys stuck around for it. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Come here.